Hello and welcome to Crypto Insights. All of the spot XRP ETFs filed by a dozen companies, mind you, are procedurally blocked and can't go live until the United States government shutdown is over. Now, we've known that for weeks, so no surprise there, but here's what is surprising. Spot ETFs for HBAR and Litecoin are going live apparently tomorrow, and that's despite the government shutdown. What gives? And no, it's not because the SEC approved them. That didn't happen. The SEC did not approve them. There was no special exception made during the shutdown just to push through ETFs for those two coins. So why are HBAR and Litecoin able to launch while XRP is stuck waiting? Is XRP being treated differently? Or did someone drop the ball? Alright, so here's a new headline from you today, XRP ETF Countdown. 2 weeks may be enough, predicts top expert. I'm not going to read the article. They were covering this perspective from Nate Garrissey. He is the president of Nova Diaz Wealth, formerly the ETF Store, and yesterday he shared this post in the evening. Next 2 weeks, Spot, XRP, Solana, Litecoin, and other ETF filings all lined up and ready for launch. Okay, so that's in line with what we've been expecting, right? And once the government shutdown is over, XRP and everything else going to get approved, right? I mean, we've all been on the same page expecting that. So what's with this news? And by the way, this is real. In fact, I'll just note this is confirmed by Eric Balcones. He's a senior ETF analyst for Bloomberg. He confirmed and he wrote tomorrow. See, he said HBAR and Litecoin spot ETFs, meaning, these ETF products that can be purchased on, traditional finance stock exchanges, will be backed by those actual assets. They're backed by HBAR, they're backed by Litecoin, going live tomorrow. And then there's Eleanor Tarrant. She is the journalist and host of Crypto in America, former Fox Business journalist, and she wrote this long poster that's on your screen running through. So I want to give a shout out and credit to her. She broadly published this, and obviously a popular topic. I mean, this single post from her, mind you, already 369,000 views. So yeah, you better believe I'm going to talk about it. Now I'm going to expand, so I'm going to share with you the highlights of what she posts. You're not going to read her post. I'm going to highlight the key parts of what she shared here, but not just that. I'm going to explain what's going on with XRP and why the hell we're not getting an XRP spot ETF launch tomorrow, right? And so, yeah, Litecoin and HBAR spot ETFs, it's official, they are going live tomorrow. This is verified through official documents. And again, I'll say again, this is even though the US government is still shut down. And of course, that is a big deal. And for good reason. I mean, there's a lot of people asking on social media. If you're on social media, you already know this. People are absolutely asking if those ETFs can launch during a shutdown. Why the hell can't XRP ETFs do the same? Which frankly, I think is a totally fair question. I was wondering myself before I looked into this. And honestly, I understand, it is kind of confusing on the surface. We probably all had about the same reaction. But once you understand how this works behind the scenes, it actually makes sense. And it actually paints a really optimistic picture for XRP, even if we have to wait just a little longer. And so here's the deal. The reason Litecoin and HBAR ETFs can launch right now is because of something called automatic effectiveness. Now, normally when a company files an S1 registration statement with the SEC, and that's the main document needed to bring an ETF to market. The SEC has to manually declare it effective before the fund can start trading, but under US securities law, there's another option built right into the system. If the issuer doesn't include a certain delaying amendment, that S1 that they file automatically becomes effective 20 days after it's filed, even if the SEC never touches it. Well, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? I actually didn't realize that the system was set up quite like that. And so that right there, this automatic effectiveness clause effectively, that's what these issuers took advantage of with HBAR and Litecoin. So they left out the delaying clause, which means their ETFs can go effective by operation of law. That's just how it works. Now, it doesn't matter if the SEC is open or closed because, of course, the clock keeps ticking. And when that 20-day window closes, which has now happened, the ETF is legally ready to go. So combine that with an approved 8A filing, which registers the ETF shares for trading on an exchange, and you're done, right? Brush your hands like that, good to go, right? And so that's why HBAR and Litecoin can launch tomorrow. The law itself is doing the heavy lifting while the SEC staff, They sit at home eating Cheetos, maybe some Doritos or some other snack that rhymes with that. But the XRP ETF's taking a different route here, and every single one of them, quite literally, so that, Canary, Bitwise, Grayscale, Wisdom Tree, 21 shares, all of them included what's called a Rule 473, and that's a delaying amendment. It's Rule 473, delaying amendment. They included that in their S1 filings with the SEC, and that clause explicitly says this registration statement will not go effective automatically. We're delaying it until the SEC declares it effective. So again, these firms filing their spot XRP ETFs. They set it up that way so that they cannot go live unless there's express permission from the SEC. So in other words, XRP issuers chose to go what is basically the traditional path, waiting for an official SEC green light, instead of relying on the automatic go clock, basically. So naturally, people are wondering why. Like, why? Was this a missed opportunity? Did they drop the ball while HBAR and Litecoin raced ahead? I mean, it might look that way, but there's actually a lot more going on. So including Rule 473 with these XRP filings with the SEC, it wasn't a mistake. It was a strategic decision. You see, most ETF issuers historically include it by default, because it gives them flexibility. It lets them work with the SEC and let's make, last-minute edits, let's address comments or questions before anything goes live. And in XRP's case, that caution is, in my mind, pretty damn understandable. I mean, XRP already went through years of regulatory drama with the SEC, and even though Ripple, of course, won that fight, the token's regulatory history might have made issuers, let's just say, far more likely to play it safe, and get the full explicit approval. And, rather than just rely on the technicality of, hey, the time has passed and the SEC sitting at home. So if their strategy is abundance of caution, that actually makes sense. It's also possible that the SEC itself preferred it this way. In many cases, they'll ask issuers to keep the delaying clause, to keep that in while they review language. And while they review other things like, custodial structures or, the market surveillance details. And so filing with Rule 473, that keeps the door open for back and forth communication between the company wants to issue the ETF and the SEC, and if they had gone the automatic route, that dialogue would have been cut off. That's just how it works, and the ETF could have gone effective, whether the SEC was ready or not, which would be perceived or could be perceived. And I think very obviously was perceived as rather risky by these firms seeking to issue the spot XRP ETFs. So, and then there's also, there's a timing control fact here. So the automatic go approach starts. It starts a 20-day clock the moment the S1 hits the SEC system. So, if your custodians, exchanges, or authorized participants aren't fully operational by then, the ETF could technically go effective before you're ready. And, well, I just say this, a massive asset like XRP with global interest, that's not something you want to happen. You want it a little bit more structured and planned, and so it's very clear that XRP is getting treated differently here, actually. The delaying clause, it gives issuers control, and they decide when to, flip the switch, as we like to say in the XRP community. And so this approach, it does reduce litigation and perception risk, and I think perception risk is probably a huge part of this, frankly. If you're launching an XRP ETF, you want it to be bulletproof. Okay. No gray areas. Okay. No openings for critics to claim, you slip through during a shutdown, because when the SEC signs off manually, it gives the ETF an extra layer of legitimacy that investors and institutions, I think at a minimum, appreciate, if not expect. At a minimum, appreciate that. So yes, in one sense, HBAR and Litecoin, they move faster. There's no denying that, but that doesn't mean XRP necessarily fell behind. It means XRP issuers are taking the path of certainty, not speed. So they're waiting for full regulatory clarity so that when they do launch, it's rock solid. And when I say full regulatory clarity, I'm talking about with the SEC as it pertains to issuers, right? And mind you, the HBAR ETF that goes live tomorrow, check this out. This is why I feel very strongly about this. The HBAR ETF that's going live tomorrow, that was filed by Canary. Now that company, as I cited earlier, it is one of the companies that filed an XRP spot ETF. They filed again, to be clear. Canary filed a spot XRP ETF and a spot HBAR ETF. They filed both of them, and they intentionally filed these ETFs differently so that, to me, it very obviously shows a more cautious approach. Was intentionally chosen by them when filing with the SEC. So their HBAR ETF going live tomorrow, their XRP one not, because they chose to file differently with the SEC. So that tells you they're not making, this isn't some sort of mistake, all of the companies did this. I don't think that's a fluke. And yeah, maybe it was the SEC saying, hey, let's do it this way. Let's go with Rule 473. It's possible. Or it's either that or these dozen firms that are filing have filed these for the spot XRP ETFs. They all came to the same conclusion. It's like, let's treat this differently for internal reasons, which we're not privy to, probably having to do with a lot of what I've been talking about in this video. So now that we understand that, let's talk about when the XRP ETF launch is likely to happen, because while the government shutdown paused everything, obviously, it hasn't stopped progress. The XRP ETF filings, they're already deep in the review process. There's no question about that, obviously. The exchanges have repaired their 8A forms. Custodians are in place, so far as we can tell. And the SEC has already paved the way with its new crypto ETF listing standards, which I've talked about a lot recently. Of course, those were approved back in September. So look, once the government reopens, in my estimation, it's not going to take long for the SEC to start declaring these things effective. I really expect it to happen quickly, and so realistically, we're probably looking at late October through maybe mid-November for the first XRP ETFs to go live. It could happen real soon. If the shutdown ends super quick, we could see trading begin literally within days. I'm not saying that's going to happen, that's not a promise. I'm just saying it's reasonable to speculate we literally within a number of days could see a spot XRP ETF trading. So it is going to be contingent upon that government shutdown ending, but it could happen sooner or later, maybe even the final week of October. That's where we're at, basically. So if it drags on, it might slip into, like I said earlier, maybe mid-November. But look, the key point is XRP ETFs, they're coming. Everything that needs to happen will happen. This is just a procedural delay, a procedural blockage, if you will. It's not some sort of fundamental setback. Of course, this is coming. And so, yes, Litecoin and HBAR, they made the headlines first, but frankly, let's be real, XRP's wave is way bigger. There is no other altcoin that has more firms that have filed to launch spot ETFs than XRP. There's the most interest specifically around XRP. So yeah, it's coming. And look, these issuers, they're building something designed to last, not just to launch fast. They're thinking long-term, big picture, right? So when the XRP ETFs finally hit the market, they will come with full SEC approval. Can you imagine that just a couple of years ago? But it's happening. It's going to happen. They're going to launch with institutional confidence. They're going to launch with legal certainty. And when that happens, which I believe, again, will happen within weeks, XRP will officially step into a new era because institutional money will finally have a regulated exchange, traded way to gain exposure. And look, that changes everything for liquidity and for perception, for long-term adoption. It's actually a very big deal over the long haul. The XRP ETF, like I said, it's coming, and when the switch flips, which again, we love to say in the XRP community, this market won't be the same ever again. The XRP market just as a whole never be the same again. And the reason I say that, it's not just hyperbole. Over a span of years and decades, an ungodly amount of money will flow into XRP because of this. And I can only imagine what that means for price. So suffice it to say higher, my friends, higher. Much, much higher.